When it comes to the French brand Alpine, or rather its official revival that began its second life in 2017, it still has yet to climb any great highs, given its rather modest lineup, not the most well-performing sales, and its pretty mediocre results in motorsports, especially considering what the company was up to back in the day. And before we jump straight to the topic of the video, we're gonna quickly go over the history of the company, which began its existence back in 1955, founded by Jean Ridelli in the French city of Dieppe. And Alpine's roots come from rallying, with Jean himself behind the wheel, participating and winning races like Mille Miglia and Coupe des Alpes, driving a Renault 4CV that he modified himself. Feeling inspired by his racing and engineering successes, Jean created the Alpine brand, named after his victory in Coupe des Alpes. The first sports car from his newly established company was the Alpine A110, a rear-engine, rear-wheel drive sports coupe based on the 4CV, with a fiberglass body from Carrosserie Shop Frey et Gessalon, a coach building company which was a pioneer when it came to fiberglass car bodies at the time. The design of the A110 was inspired by the Franco-American coupe Le Marquis, also based on the 4CV. By the way, the A110 itself weighed just over 1100 pounds and was equipped with a 740cc 4-cylinder engine. This combination made the A110 quite a nimble and peppy car, winning rallies in Dieppe and repeating victories in the Coupe des Alpes. But later, in 1958, the Alpine A108 was released, based on the Renault Dauphine. Besides a fiberglass body, the A108 also received a chassis with a backbone tubular frame. Towards the 1960s, Jean's successes attracted the attention of Renault, which eventually began closely collaborating with him. That's also when Alpine adapted the car to use parts from the new Renault R8. And the A108 model also participated in competitions, winning the Coupe des Alpes in 1960 and the Tour de Corse in 1961 and 1962. In addition to rallying, it also competed on the tarmac as well. However, the most interesting part began with the release of the A110 in 1963, a direct evolution of the A108, weighing just 1,556 pounds and initially equipped with a 1.1-liter engine from the Renault R8, modified by Amedei Gardini. The A110 caused quite a stir in the world of motorsport. They started counting victories from 1967 at the Lyon-Charbonnières Rally, the Tour de Corse Rally in 1968, 1969 and 1970, and even winning the Monte Carlo Rally in 1971 and 1973. Besides rallying, the A110 also participated in the Tour de France, finishing second in 1969 and third in 1970, and winning in the GT category in the European Hill Climb Championship in 1969. So, naturally, there was some demand for the A110, and yet the car could still disappoint its buyers. Being a true sports car, it was not the best pick for everyday use, having a cramped interior, stiff suspension, and other traits, typical of strictly sporty vehicles. Because of this, it was decided to develop a more practical and even luxurious replacement for the A110. And today, we'll talk about it, named the Alpine A310. Let's begin. The development of the A310 began back in 1968. Compared to the race-oriented A110, the new model was intended to be a comfortable 2+2 Grand Tour. And adhering to established traditions, the engineers based it on the central tubular frame from the Alpine A110 GT4, the extended 4-seater version of the A110. The rear axle was taken from the Renault R8, but instead of swing axle suspension, all 4 wheels featured double wishbones and disc brakes. Initially, they wanted to install a 3-liter V8 under the rear hood of the car, which was a joint development by Ridelli, Gordini and Renault, and was used in the A211 Sports prototype. However, during development, the engineers decided to go with a 1.6-liter 4-cylinder engine producing 125 horsepower using 2 Weber twin-barrel carburetors. This engine was also featured in the A110 since 1968, and it was paired with a 5-speed manual transmission. And the aggressive, angular, and maybe even somewhat quirky design of the fiberglass body was the work of Michel Belligand and Yves Le Gall under the direction of Trevor Fiore, who was working at Carrozzeria Fissore at the time. And the Grand Tour, presented at the Geneva Motor Show in March 1971, turned out to be just over 1.5 feet longer and 440 pounds heavier than the A110. This allowed the 2050-pound A310 and its very first VE modification to accelerate to 60 miles per hour in 8.4 seconds, with a top speed of 124 miles per hour, being much slower compared to the A110, which still continued production after the release of the A310. However, it was faster than its own benchmark, which was the Porsche 911. In general, both cars were often compared to each other, and for a good reason, as both were rear-engined, rear-wheel drive Grand Tours. But in comparison with the 911, many even praised the A310 with its 40 to 60 weight distribution, which on paper would be slightly worse than the 911's 42 to 58, but the rear of the A310 behaved more stably during active driving. Early 911s had a rather notorious reputation due to very demanding driving and oversteering caused by the rear engine layout. Not to mention that Ridelli himself often looked towards Porsche when creating his cars. In September of the same year, the model began to be delivered to customers, but with slight differences from the Geneva show prototype, as the rear lights were moved under the bumper, unlike the prototype which had the lights on top. And journalists had rather mixed opinions about the car. Some described it very positively. For example, as John Bolster reported for the British magazine Autosport, "First impressions were good because the highly tuned engine is phenomenally flexible, idling indefinitely in traffic blocks without overheating. The ride is also extremely comfortable. The new suspension absorbing the bumps while the car remains level. The cornering power is tremendously high, with virtually no roll. One drives faster and faster through bends, never reaching the limit, even in the mountains, and the brakes do not fade." The new Alpine Renault A310 sets new standards for small-engine sports cars. And at the same time, the German magazine Auto Review described the car as too underpowered for an enthusiast car and not luxurious enough for a luxury car. The issues noted included vague shifting due to the long linkage between the gearbox and the gear lever, electrical problems, questionable waterproofing, an unpleasant smell in the cabin during hot weather due to the fiberglass body, and the virtual absence of luggage space. The small front trunk was already reduced in size by the fuel tank, not to mention the spare tire that was located there as well, leaving the driver and at most one passenger to place their luggage on the rear seats. But many simply removed the spare tire and left it at home. The luxurious Grand Tourer also had a fitting price, starting at 44,800 francs. Yet the build quality of the early A310s was still lacking, which was, all in all, not surprising, since this model factually represented Alpine's first experience in creating a daily driving car for a broader audience. By 1973, due to rather weak sales that put Alpine in a difficult financial situation, Jean Ridelli sold the controlling stake in his company to Renault, though he remained involved. And by the next year, the VF modification appeared, in which the engine was equipped with Bosch DJ-tronic electronic ignition instead of dual carburetors. Thus, the power and speed characteristics were barely altered, which can't be said for the car's appearance, as the louvers over the engine compartment began to disappear due to problems with French safety regulations, under the pretext that the louvers severely limited visibility. However, they remained an option for export models. And even earlier, the NACA ducts, which were previously located closer to the windshield, were moved forward, now closer to the nose of the car. And it is often possible to see these relocated NACA ducts on the VE models as well. By 1979, the cost of the A310 with DJ-tronic was 71,200 francs. And following tradition, the French Gendarmerie, specifically their Brigade Rapide d'Intervention, or Quick Intervention Brigade, which used the fastest domestic cars in their fleet, acquired a few A310s as well, doing so multiple times and in different modifications. And given such prices, even exporting the car couldn't solve its low sales. For the four-cylinder A310, 1973 was the peak year, selling 666 units. And due to the oil embargo imposed in the same year, sales nearly halved by 1974. Alpine decided to respond to that 2 years later with the A310 VG modification, where the engine, instead of the usual Bosch DJ-tronic, now had a single Weber carburetor, producing only 95 horsepower, making it not only the most budget-friendly, but also the slowest version, with a 0 to 60 time of just about 10 seconds. Even for the budget version, they demanded 61,700 francs. In total, only 2,344 cylinder A310s were sold. At this point, the car might have been done for, if not for the engineers from Peugeot, Renault and Volvo, who by 1975 had finally completed the development of the PRV V6 engine. And by the next year, the Alpine A310 went through a facelift, with an updated appearance designed by Peter Stevens and Robert Apron, the latter also being the chief designer at Renault at the time. Right away, the most notable change in the new A310 was the new front end, with a more modest arrangement of 4 headlights instead of 6, and a Renault badge in the center. The car also received new wheels with 3 lug mounts and lost its ducts on the fenders. And after the body of the car was aerodynamically tested in a wind tunnel, it was equipped with 2 spoilers, one in the front and one in the rear. As for the comfort and safety equipment, the car also received power mirrors and windows, 2-point seat belts for the rear seats, and an optional air conditioner. But the most significant change was under the hood of the A310, where a 2.7-liter carbureted V6 engine producing 148 horsepower was installed, paired with a 4-speed manual transmission. This modification was named the VA, and production of the fuel-injected VF was stopped in April 1976, while the budget VG continued production for another 3 months. The 6-cylinder Alpine could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 7.4 seconds and had a top speed of 140 miles per hour, increasing the car's weight to 2,160 pounds and changing the weight distribution to 33% on the front and 67% on the rear. Here's how auto journalist Martin Buckley described the new 6-cylinder A310. I was unprepared for how well this car went. Once the full length of the throttle travel was discovered, it seemed to have acceleration not that far behind the 911, delivered with a lusty offbeat growl. This V6 is not a sports car engine, but its willingness to spin hard to its red line, pulling strongly and smoothly all the way, was as impressive as its ability to lug around in third and fourth from 1200 RPM or cruise peacefully on top. The 6-cylinder version, priced at 77,900 francs, proved to be much more successful than the 4-cylinder model. Likely because with that price tag, buyers already expected something more powerful. Initially, only 140 units were produced in 1976, but this increased significantly to 1,220 units in 1977, including exports. The discontinuation of the A110 in the same year allowed the company to focus on the A310, and Renault turned to Hulies to develop a sportier version, which will soon follow in the footsteps of the A110 and will go rallying. And Hulies presented the Alpine A310 V6 Group 4, referencing one of the rally car classification groups in its name. As a limited option, similar bodywork enhancements, including widened fenders and spoilers, excluding the array of fog lights, were available on the regular A310. These versions also featured wider tires and a 5-speed gearbox instead of the standard 4-speed, with only 30 road-going examples of the A310 VA Group 4 produced in total. But apart from this limited series, the car did not see significant changes until 1981, when Renault launched the second series of the A310 V6, codenamed VAA, now featuring a bunch of new enhancements such as a 5-speed gearbox, rear suspension, and 4-point rims, all borrowed from the Renault 5-turbo hot hatch. As for the body, the thin rubber bumpers have been replaced with full plastic wraparound bumpers, and enlarged wheel arches were also noticeable. Special editions also made their mark on the second series. From 1983, the Fleischmann manufactured Pack GT option became available, inspired by the racing versions of the A310, like the Group 4, featuring a wider fiberglass bodywork with even larger spoilers both at the front and rear. And yet, the rarest and most sought after by the collectors to this day became the limited edition A310 Pack GT Boulogne, with only 27 units made in total. It featured a 2.8-liter V6 engine from the PRV lineup, equipped with 3 Weber carburetors that increased its power output to 193 horsepower. This allowed the car to go from 0 to 60 in about 7.2 seconds with a top speed of 146 miles per hour. But speaking of racing-inspired packages, it is impossible not to mention the racing achievements of the A310. Although, in comparison with the A110, the car participated without much distinction and with rather mediocre results. The car took part in rallying and rallycross in groups 4 and 5, and even the GCP group, or Grand Touring Prototype, in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. There were only a few noteworthy moments, such as in rallying, where driver Guy Fréquelin won the French Rally Championship in 1977, driving a 240 horsepower A310, winning 10 stages in one season, thereby even setting a national record. But apart from this, the car did not achieve anything significant and could not match the successes of its predecessor. In the 24 Hours of Le Mans, with driver Bernard Decure, the A310 participated in 1977 and 1978, but in both races it was disqualified due to technical issues, and with Renault shifting its focus towards Formula 1, the A310 no longer competed in rallying or endurance racing. The A310 model was produced until 1984, with a total production of 9,276 six-cylinder A310s, or including the 4-cylinder models, a total of 11,616 cars were manufactured. From 1984 onwards, it was succeeded by the new Renault Alpine GTA, or Gran Turismo Alpine, which inherited the shape of the A310 and adapted it for the next decade. However, with Jean Rideli's departure from Alpine and the complete sale of his company to Renault in 1977, the GTA became the first Alpine car developed under Renault's full control. Therefore, it can be said that this Grand Tour essentially represented Renault more than it did Alpine. You've been watching Redline, and if you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and go check out some other videos as well. And I'll see you in the next episode.